So welcome to Behind the Resource Card. This is a speaker series that is meant to humanize and normalize these hotlines that appear on our resource cards here at Hope for the Day. So if you haven't seen those before, that's these. And we have these wonderful resource cards for all of our different areas of specialty and conversations. And often when we hand these out at community spaces and music venues, people take them, but they don't really know what they're going to get. And it can be really uncomfortable and uncertain to what type of experience they may have when they're calling for help or when they're calling for help for a loved one. So I want to validate that it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to ask for help.
Hi everyone, my name is Bri Barnett. I'm the Director of Advancement at Trans Lifeline, and I use they and she pronouns. Trans Lifeline has existed since the end of 2014, so 7 years. We were founded because trans people also have unique needs, and our mental health outcomes are often impacted by experiences of transphobia, where peer support, other trans people, are the most qualified people to be able to offer that kind of support. Also, because one of our founders had the experience of reaching out to another line and having the police show up at her door as a result, being involuntarily hospitalized, and an experience that was deeply traumatic for her, which also gave her the inspiration for a line not only where people are providing peer support, but where we have a policy against involving the police on any of our calls through complete caller anonymity. Yeah, so when someone calls into our line, the first thing you should expect is to not be put on hold. We have found that generally being put on hold is something when we surveyed our callers, they found they didn't like. And so accordingly, if you don't get through, you'll get a short message letting you know and be encouraged to call back. If you do get through, you'll be paired with a trans peer who has been trained to provide peer support in a multi-hour training and apprenticeship model. And you'll be able to talk about whatever is present for you. That means you'll be able to talk about suicidality if you're experiencing that. You can also talk about experiences of discrimination. You can talk about if you're questioning your gender. We aren't there just for suicidality. We're there for any issue trans people are facing. We also, of course, are there for you can talk to us about anything, right? So if you actually are thinking about ending your life very actively, you can have that conversation. You can know it will be completely anonymous. Our peer support specialists are trained to just talk with you where you are. And so another thing you can expect, as I mentioned earlier, is that we will never involve the police in your call unless you explicitly not only ask us to, but actually give us the identifying information that we would need in order to help connect you to the emergency services. And if you decide to go down that route, our operators are also trained to teach you what to expect. Yeah, I think at Trans Lifeline, things happen for relatively similar reasons, Terrain. I think especially when it comes to political attacks against trans people, we see huge spikes to our call volume. For example, last June, we saw the Trump administration trying to roll back health care protections for trans people. The same week that J.K. Rowling was really upping her public transphobia. And there was a Supreme Court case decision that wasn't decided yet, but was coming the following week, where the court was basically deciding whether or not it's legal to discriminate against trans people in areas of employment. We saw a dramatic increase on our call volume that week, so much so it drove up the entire month. Similarly, we see this even at the local level when we look. So for example, this May, the Texas legislature was considering a bill to ban trans youth from basically being able to participate in sports in schools, being able to be kids, have access to teams and athletics and friends. We saw a 72% increase in calls from Texas during that month. So really, I think it's important to note that sometimes people are really hurting because they're being hurt, especially in the public discourse and through the politicalization of trans people right now. Yeah, for us, we have several misunderstandings and misconceptions. I think the first is that we're like just a suicide hotline, meaning that I think a lot of people don't understand that we're there to provide peer support or even what peer support means. Surprisingly, alongside that is the misconception that our operators are trans and cis, even though I think we're very proud and vocal about the fact that all of our operators are trans as a distinguishing factor, at least on the main line. Other misconceptions, somewhat surprisingly, that we're just there for trans people. We actually do have a callback service for the family and friends of trans people who want to know how to better support their trans loved one. On that same model of peer support, the people who give you a call back are cisgender. So you'll be talking to another person with the lived experience of supporting a trans person. And then finally, I'd say, or not quite finally, we also offer our services in Spanish, I think is another thing not a lot of people know about, although currently that program is paused while we bring on additional staffing and volunteers to it. And then finally, that we're also just a hotline, that we also have a microgrants program where we give trans people money to legally change their name and gender, to access HRT, specialized support for trans people who are imprisoned or detained. So we are limited, of course, by our scope, by our budget, but as much as possible, we try to act on our belief that mental health is often about the material conditions in an individual's life. And while peer support, emotional support is massively helpful, we often think that it alone is not enough, and there does need to be that material change as well. I want minors to know, I think first of all that our operators are trans, but they are not minors. You have to be over the age of 18 to work, to even volunteer on our line. So if you're looking for to connect with someone specifically around the lens of peer support as a young person, there are other lines for that, although there you might not get someone who is trans. For example, Youthline in Oregon, I know is a really impressive resource. I'd like to, of course, reiterate the bit about mandated reporting, that unless you give us the information and you ask for it, no one's going to be involved who you don't want to be. And then finally, that we really are here for a breadth of issues that face young people, from having unsupportive family, not being able to come out, to accessing HRT, to what might be coming up for you around some of the political attacks that are really specifically targeted at young trans people right now. We're there for you for all of those. So Trans Lifeline, all of our operators are trained in how to provide peer support specifically, so how to relate to people on what they're going through based off of your own lived experiences, and also being able to name when those lived experiences don't align. I think significantly, also part of our training includes kind of, for some of the people who are volunteering on our lines with more clinical backgrounds, it includes parts around not engaging in risk assessments as much, because that's not what we're there to do, is to assess, you know, how much of a threat you are to yourself. We're there to just connect with you as a person. So we don't do risk assessments on our line, and that's part of our volunteer training. Volunteers also go through an extensive onboarding process after they complete trainings, where they start off joining more experienced operators' calls. They then will switch to answering calls with a more experienced operator there to help. And then finally, they'll be operating calls on their own. I think other important parts of our onboarding training include, we now have dedicated sections and continuing education also around how to provide peer support to people experiencing domestic and intimate partner violence, which we broadly define to include both intimate partners, chosen partners, as well as you know, partners like family, domestic situations. So all of those are how our training takes place. And then if someone has a bad experience, we encourage you to report that through our website. We have a contact form that has information, that has a segment for reporting information like that, especially if you can include the time of the call. If you feel comfortable including other identifying information like your number. While our operators do not have access to any identifying information, we do use a coded and anonymous database in order to be able to track and sometimes review calls, both to ensure quality and then also as a way of, unfortunately, sometimes our line is targeted by trolls, and we need a mechanism in order to be able to limit bad actors repeatedly calling and harassing our staff. Yeah, so for us, you can just go to translifeline.org, and in our little menu, there's a section for volunteering, I believe under our About section, but it also might just immediately pop up. We take applications, and the main requirements to be a volunteer on our line are, of course, that you are trans and that you are over the age of 18. Also, there will be an application process as we do screen for other experiences, both lived and also just making sure that you're actually a good fit and in a place in your life where you're really able to help support other people. So I've been doing, I feel like, to me, I think all social change work is in a way suicide prevention work. I think trying to create a more supportive society, a society where people have the basic economic prosperity, housing, healthcare they need to really feel like the future has a place for them. And it is suicide prevention work. I've been doing that work for over a decade now. I've been at Trans Lifeline specifically for a bit over 2.5 years. And I come to this work broadly for social justice reasons, but then also as a trans person, having real experiences of suicidality throughout my life, and also having community members be lost over time. I think it's very endemic within the community, and it's endemic in this way where even people who have not made an attempt or have themselves probably are familiar with it just because we live in such a transphobic world. So I think that is a really powerful motivation for many trans people. I think it's also why you've seen trans people throughout history continuing this tradition of mutual aid for each other, from the work of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson in the 70s going forward, all the way to today. Trans people have always taken care of each other, and we always will as long as we exist, which will be forever. I'd like to say that our line is also there for that. If you're trans, I think supporting other members in the community, supporting friends, is something that many of our operators and many people in community have experience with. That is something worth talking through itself. That something's hard. It's something that can impact your mental health, as well as it potentially having some coaching applications on how to show up for your friends. For cis people, we do have our family and friends line, which we are also recruiting volunteers for right now. But that is another resource for people who have experience supporting trans people, perhaps even seeing trans people struggle with mental health, talking through about the best ways you can show up for them. I suppose what I'd like to share is we all have a role in making the world a better place, and especially when it comes to trans people. We know through studies with trans youth that the #1 determining factor on the mental health outcomes for trans youth is having supportive people in their lives, especially family. That you actually showing up, doing the work, educating yourself. If you have difficult feelings around someone's transition, not processing those with that person, these types of actions are super tangible. Suicide prevention, they're super tangible ways to improve the mental health of trans people. Being an active ally, refusing to tolerate transphobia in your workplaces and the environments you're in, is also really important, because not all trans people are out, especially in a world where it doesn't feel safe to be out. Being actively interrupting transphobia, in addition to working to create a society where people can more easily see a place for themselves, are really excellent ways to make a difference.